The cameras were moments away from going live, but Meghan Markle could feel the weight pressing down on her chest. She sat quietly in the green room, hands folded, her face calm, but her mind racing. It had been almost 6 months since she had spoken publicly. Her PR team had worked carefully to plan this appearance on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, believing it would be a gentle, controlled return. Not a confrontation, not a courtroom, just laughter, charm, and maybe a little honesty. Producers had promised it would be lighthearted, some jokes about British tabloids. Maybe a question or two about motherhood, a short conversation about her podcast. Meghan had rehearsed her answers, practiced her smile, and reminded herself over and over that this was safe. But as the countdown began and her cue was called, she felt a small knot twist inside her stomach. The lights hit her face. As she walked on stage, the audience clapped loudly. Colbert greeted her with a handshake and a smile, then motioned toward the chair. Meghan sat down, crossing her legs, trying to match his energy. For the first few minutes, everything flowed smoothly. He made a few jabs at British paparazzi. She laughed, playfully agreeing. The audience chuckled. It felt warm, but then something changed. Subtle, almost invisible, like a sudden draft in a room. Colbert tilted his head, smiled that familiar, sharp smile of his, and leaned in slightly. "Don't you think," he began, "that stepping away from the royal family while still using the title is a bit contradictory?" The air shifted. Meghan's eyes blinked once. The smile on her face didn't fully vanish, but it changed. Her fingers pressed slightly into the fabric of her dress. "I don't think surviving something is the same as profiting from it," she said slowly, keeping her voice calm. Colbert nodded, as if thoughtful. But it was clear he wasn't done. "But haven't you also, by your own admission, stepped back into the spotlight you once called toxic?" A soft, uneasy sound rose from the audience. A laugh, but not from amusement, more like discomfort. Meghan straightened her back and adjusted the mic on her lapel. "You invited me here, Stephen," she replied. "I didn't barge into this chair." For a few seconds they stared at each other. This set was bright, colorful, but the mood had turned gray. Colbert pressed on. He quoted lines from her interviews, podcast episodes, even her Netflix series. Each question came sharper than the last, covered in layers of irony and sarcasm. Meghan tried to answer with grace. Her tone remained controlled, but her body told a different story. Her hands began to twitch. Her voice lost some of its warmth. And then he said it. "But what about the staff members who said you made their lives hell? Are they lying too?" That was it. The silence in the studio was instant. No one laughed. No one moved. Even the camera operators froze. Meghan didn't speak at first. Her eyes darted sideways, her breath caught, and her lips trembled. When she did speak, her voice was low. "That's not a question," she said. A headline. Colbert leaned back slightly. Whether he was aware he had crossed a line or proud of it was unclear. He chuckled awkwardly. "We just ask the questions, Meghan. It's what we do here." But no one in the room laughed. Not even the band. Meghan's voice cracked slightly as she spoke into the mic for the last time. "You're not asking questions. You're using my pain as entertainment." Then, in front of the cameras, the band, the audience, and millions who would see it later, she unpinned a microphone from her collar. She stood up, smoothed her dress, and walked off the set. No music played. No closing joke. Just an empty chair, a blinking host, and an audience too stunned to clap. Moments later, the internet erupted. Within minutes, the clip had been uploaded by viewers who had recorded it. The hashtag started trending. Hashtag royal tears. Hashtag Colbert crossed the line. Hashtag Meghan deserved better. CBS executives rushed to contain the storm. The official clip was pulled, but it was too late. The footage had already been reposted thousands of times. On Twitter, the moment was being analyzed frame by frame. On TikTok, influencers gave emotional reactions. On Instagram, her final line was already overlaid on dramatic music and reshared by mental health advocates. But behind the trending topics, the real question echoed through newsrooms and political offices. What had just happened, and what would happen next?
Backstage.
The air was electric and cold. The moment Meghan Markle walked off set, staffers scrambled in every direction, some to follow her, others to alert producers, and a few simply frozen, staring at the monitor showing the live feed cutting awkwardly to commercial. Stephen Colbert remained in his chair, blinking at the camera like a man who had just survived an explosion. He himself triggered. The clip didn't take hours to go viral, it took seconds. Before CBS could even pull the segment from its digital queue, screen recordings were flooding X, TikTok, and Instagram. In living rooms and on subway rides across the world, millions of people were watching the same moment again and again. Meghan's voice trembling, her face composed but broken. And then the quiet walk out. No music, no applause. Tension you could taste. The hashtags exploded. Hashtag royal tears. Hashtag Colbert crossed the line. Hashtag Meghan deserved better. Memes were already being made. Think pieces appeared by midnight. Some journalists praised Colbert's tough questions as real journalism. Others called it a masterclass in cruelty. Meanwhile, Meghan had locked herself in a black SUV outside the studio, flanked by 2 aides and her head of communications. Her phone buzzed nonstop, but she didn't touch it. Her hands rested still in her lap. She stared straight ahead, her jaw locked. No tears now. Just silence. In a New York media tower, the CBS executive board gathered in an emergency call. The legal team warned that Meghan's team might file a public complaint or worse, sue for defamation and emotional distress. Colbert's producer defended the segment. She knew what kind of show this was. But another executive shot back. She was ambushed. That wasn't journalism. That was live provocation. At Colbert's home, a very different kind of silence filled the room. He sat alone in his office watching the clip again. For the first time in years, he didn't feel clever. He had interviewed presidents, prime ministers, war veterans. But this wasn't pride swelling in his chest. It was something else. Regret? Maybe. But he didn't say a word. By morning. The headlines had taken sides. The Guardian. A new line. Crossed Markle walks out after Colbert interrogation. Fox News. Colbert holds Meghan accountable. Was it about time? Vogue. From smear to silence, why Meghan's pain isn't up for debate, but the real war broke out on social media. Celebrities began choosing sides. Viola Davis posted a black square with a single word. Enough. Oprah reposted the clip with a quote. When people show you who they are, believe them. Even Michelle Obama liked a comment that read, "This isn't journalism, it's public shaming." Inside Buckingham Palace, the situation triggered immediate concern. Royal advisors met in hushed tones, though Meghan was no longer a working royal. Her name and her story were still linked to the crown, and this very public humiliation wasn't just about ratings anymore. It was starting to look like a cultural referendum. A classified memo circulated within the palace advised caution in public responses. Media tone suggests emotional exploitation of the Duchess. Damage to royal image likely if association is not handled delicately. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., something strange was happening. Several senior aides within the White House received briefing notes. President Harris, currently preparing for an international climate summit, was quietly updated on the Colbert-Markle incident under the category of media diplomacy and public sentiment risk. One memo read, "Due to growing public support for Meghan Markle, particularly among young voters and mental health advocacy groups, White House should refrain from public commentary. However, be advised, any appearance of complicity in the media attack may lead to reputational damage among key demographics." It was no longer a celebrity moment. it had become a political one. Back at CBS headquarters, executives made a decision. The segment would not re-air. The YouTube upload was officially removed, labeled as editorial discretion. Colbert's staff received a private instruction: issue no comments, take no interviews, and draft a statement for the next show. But Colbert hadn't written a statement yet. He had watched the clip 17 times, and every time he noticed the same thing: not Meghan's silence, not even her tears, but the way the audience went completely still. How they didn't laugh, didn't clap, didn't move, as if something sacred had been broken right there on stage. A line crossed, not just in conversation, but in culture, and somewhere in Los Angeles. Behind closed doors and drawn curtains, Meghan sat at her kitchen table with her team. She wasn't reading comments, she wasn't watching clips. But her assistant was quietly compiling every post, every headline, every quote, building a case. Not legal, not official, but something deeper, because Meghan Markle wasn't planning another interview. She was preparing something far more dangerous: a complete, unspoken silence that was already louder than any apology could ever be. It started with one post, then 1,000, then a global wave. Outside CBS headquarters in New York, a small group of protesters gathered on the sidewalk, holding signs that read, "We believe Meghan." Pain is not a punchline, and dignity. Over ratings, by midday, it had swelled into hundreds. Then thousands. Camera crews arrived. Helicopters hovered. The images flooded every major outlet. American citizens, standing not for politics or policy, but for decency. Stephen Colbert's name trended for the 4th day in a row. But not with admiration. Headlines now described him with words like arrogant, tone-deaf, and unapologetic. Clips from past interviews circulated, painting a new picture of his style: clever, yes, but often cruel. A TikTok thread titled "Colbert's Greatest Gaslights" gained over 10 million views in 48 hours. CBS tried to spin it. They arranged for Colbert to deliver a carefully worded on-air apology. He opened his next show with a flat joke. "Turns out the royal exit wasn't just from the palace, huh?" The audience chuckled nervously. But the tension hung heavy in the air. Then, with a forced sincerity, he said, "Maybe I pushed too hard. But hey, I've interviewed senators with thicker skin." The joke died in his throat. The room stayed quiet. Meanwhile, Meghan Markle remained unseen. She issued no new statement, gave no interviews, but her absence only magnified her presence. The silence was not weakness, it was weight. And that weight began to shift public consciousness in Los Angeles. A private roundtable was held with prominent female leaders, lawyers, actresses, activists, and political figures. Among them was Viola Davis, Ava DuVernay, and a representative from the UN Human Rights Office. They discussed the larger implications of the interview: how trauma is commodified, how women, especially women of color, are often cornered into justifying their own pain for public consumption. What began as support for Meghan slowly became a reckoning with the very culture that created the moment. Colbert wasn't the only one being scrutinized. Other late-night hosts watched nervously from the shadows. Media think pieces exploded, calling for a new ethics of celebrity journalism. In London, the royal institution felt the pressure too. A leaked internal memo from Buckingham Palace revealed just how fragile things had become. This is no longer a family matter. It is a global image crisis. British diplomats began quiet discussions with U.S. officials about public de-escalation. A statement was drafted and redrafted, meant to acknowledge Meghan's pain without reigniting the media fire. But before they could release it, the BBC dropped a bombshell. A 2-hour investigative documentary titled Crown and Conflict aired during prime time, hosted by award-winning journalist Amelia North. It featured exclusive interviews with former palace staff, media analysts, and even a royal insider who chose to remain anonymous. The report laid bare a campaign of coordinated press leaks and character assassination targeted at Meghan over the last 5 years. Screenshots of emails, voice memos, confidential correspondence between tabloids and Palisades. And then came the footage never before seen behind-the-scenes clips from Meghan's earliest public appearances as a duchess. Off-camera moments of exhaustion, moments where she asked for breaks, moments where her tears were wiped before interviews. One line from a Palisade echoed through the broadcast. The plan wasn't to destroy her, just to break her in slowly. I didn't realize she was already broken. The internet erupted once again. Now, the backlash wasn't just against Colbert, it was against the system, the machine, the combined force of media, monarchy, and corporate interests that had pushed one woman into silence. Celebrities began to rally more openly. Beyoncé tweeted, "Strength isn't loud. Sometimes it walks away." Michelle Obama followed up with, "The world listens differently now." And still Meghan said nothing. Her spokesperson issued a final message that Friday evening, simple, elegant, icy. She has spoken once. She does not need to speak again. At CBS, pressure mounted. Executives held closed-door meetings well past midnight. Advertisers were threatening to pull support. 2 major sponsors had already backed out. Colbert's writing. Staff was divided. Some demanded more accountability. Others suggested taking a break from air. Then came the internal vote. A senior executive quietly proposed a 2-week hiatus. Not a suspension, just space, room to breathe. Colbert pushed back, but the board had made up its mind. Behind the cameras, everything was shifting. What had once been a platform for influence had become a stage for interrogation. Audiences didn't want blood anymore, they wanted truth. And for the first time in years, the most powerful voices in media were beginning to ask themselves, was it ever about the questions? Or had it always been about control? And far from the noise, in a quiet home tucked away from the world, Meghan sat with her son in her lap, reading a children's book about quiet heroes, not fallen queens, not victims, just voices that refused to break. Across global newsrooms, the mood had turned. What began as a trending moment had now escalated into a full-blown cultural crisis. In boardrooms, political offices, media houses, even royal corridors, Meghan Markle's silent exit had become an unstoppable symbol. But as the outrage swelled, something more complex began unfolding beneath the surface. The United Nations Office on Human Rights sent an official invitation to Meghan's foundation. They wanted her to speak privately, at first on media violence and emotional exploitation in journalism. The invitation wasn't performative, it was strategic. Internal notes from the UN showed growing concern over how media narratives were shaping public perception, especially concerning women and racial minorities. Meghan's interview had simply ignited what had been simmering for years. Her team received the letter with quiet acknowledgement. No promises. No rejections. Just a pause. Meghan was watching, waiting, choosing silence, not out of fear, but calculation. Her lawyers were also preparing. Though no lawsuit had been announced, CBS was unofficially contacted to preserve all behind-the-scenes footage of the interview. A legal warning in everything but name. Inside CBS, executives were now walking on broken glass. The Colbert team had been placed on internal review. Advertisers continued to back out quietly. Colbert himself was off-air. The studio dark, the usual rhythm of tapings halted. Behind closed doors, he was rewriting his next statement. It wouldn't be a joke, not this time. Meanwhile, the ripple had reached Europe in unexpected ways. In Germany, France, and even parts of Scandinavia, journalists began openly criticizing not only American media, but their own complicity in similar cultural takedowns. A German nightly news program aired a segment titled, "When Truth Becomes Theater: The Meghan Markle Moment." In France, a feminist political party issued a statement. accusing global media of using women's trauma as a new form of soft violence. And in London, the Royal Press Office faced a disaster brewing on multiple fronts. Emails continued to leak. Anonymous staffers from years past spoke out. One former aide, with no clear motive except conscience, told the Times that palace officials had received advance summaries of Meghan's interviews, any views, even ones meant to be private. "We knew what was coming. We always knew," the aide said. "We just let her walk into the storm." The story had turned from celebrity drama to institutional indictment. And the Crown wasn't ready. The palace issued a rare press statement. "Late on a Sunday night, we deeply value the mental well-being of all individuals and reject any suggestion that harm, intentional or not, was ever our goal. We respect the Duchess's right to privacy and peace." But it was too late, too vague, too polished. A BBC journalist responded live on air. "Respect without accountability is not compassion, it's branding." In New York, protest signs were now joined by candles and photographs, not of royalty, not of Colbert, but of young women, journalists, and public figures who had suffered similar media breakdowns. Britney Spears, Monica Lewinsky, Whitney Houston, even journalists who had been pushed out for calling truth to power. It wasn't just about Meghan anymore. She had become the face of something bigger. And still she said nothing. In Washington, political momentum had started to build. Several senators, including those from California and New York, drafted a bipartisan bill focused on ethical broadcasting practices and protection against psychological harassment in televised interviews. The bill was symbolic but powerful. Showed lawmakers were watching too. One Democratic senator tweeted, "It's time we separate journalism from humiliation." Meanwhile, late at night, Meghan finally sat down at her kitchen table, a blank notebook in front of her. No cameras, no publicist. Just her and the silence that had followed her for days. She didn't cry, she didn't smile, she didn't plan a comeback. She wrote only a single line at the top of the page. "This was never about defending myself. 'Twas about stopping the cycle." The next morning, her team released a short message. The Duchess will attend the UN Media and Ethics Summit next month as a private speaker. The world froze. No interviews, no press tour, no brand campaign. Just a chair, a room, and a platform she would use once not for herself but for every voice that had ever been silenced by applause that wasn't real. Because this time, when she spoke, there would be no laughter, only truth. And the silence that finally listened, asked ChatGPT, the confirmation of Meghan. Markle's attendance at the UN Media and Ethics Summit ignited a new phase of the global reaction, no longer emotional, no longer chaotic, but structured, focused, and dangerously intelligent. Major news outlets cleared prime-time slots. Journalists scrambled for credentials. Human rights organizations and advocacy groups, long ignored in nightly coverage, were suddenly invited onto morning shows to discuss the deeper implications of media conduct. And while the public anticipated a speech, behind closed doors, something more critical was taking shape. In Geneva, where the summit would be held, private briefings were already underway. Delegates from 63 countries reviewed transcripts, press behavior reports, and trending global opinion polls. The summit was no longer just a forum, it had become a tribunal of ideas. Meghan's segment on Colbert's show was printed, dissected, and inserted into ethical case studies, alongside examples from war journalism and trauma reporting. Inside the summit's planning committee, an internal email read, "This is no longer about one woman or one host. It's about the boundaries between free speech and televised emotional harm." Markle's presence makes this personal, but the world needs it to be political. CBS, aware of the approaching storm, released a new statement ahead of the summit. This time, it was more formal, more cautious. "We support meaningful dialogue about the role of media in society and regret any pain caused by the recent segment." But it landed flat. No accountability, no apology. The words were read, not heard. Colbert, still on leave, recorded a private message for CBS board members. In it, he acknowledged crossing a line but claimed he had only done what his platform encouraged, push boundaries in search of truth. But that excuse, once celebrated, now sounded like a defensive spectacle over responsibility. And then came the real blow. Just 48 hours before Meghan's scheduled appearance, The Atlantic published an investigative expose titled "The Interview That Changed Nothing Until It Changed Everything." It revealed internal emails from CBS producers admitting that the tone of the Colbert interview had been altered mid-show under executive direction. The producers had been told to press harder, draw headlines due to network pressure from advertisers seeking edgy viral content. The emails included damning lines. "She's come break it open. Push the contradiction angle. She flinch. Go in soft. Flip the knife late." The report detonated across the media landscape. It confirmed what many had suspected. The ambush was not spontaneous. It was orchestrated. Colbert wasn't improvising. He was following a script handed down by ratings-hungry executives. Public outrage reignited with fresh fury. Celebrities re-entered the conversation. Mental health organizations demanded action. A petition calling for an independent oversight committee on televised ethics reached 5 million signatures in 36 hours. At the UN summit, the opening session was tense. Cameras flashed. Journalists from every continent watched as speaker. After speaker took the stage, activists, diplomats, media scholars, and then, finally, she walked in. Meghan entered without security swarming around her. No designer label broadcasted. No entourage behind her. Just a notepad in hand and a single silver pin on her blazer, a white feather, symbol of silent resistance. She waited for the room to settle before stepping up to the podium. There were no opening jokes. No clever icebreakers, only this. When you live through fire, you don't fear heat, you fear silence. Her voice was steady, not loud, but it carried. She spoke not about herself, but about the women who had walked before her. About the moments when media stopped being a mirror and became a weapon. About the difference between accountability and aggression. About the long, unspoken violence of being asked to explain your pain for applause. She read the emails from CBS out loud, one by one, slowly, then, without naming Colbert directly. She looked straight at the International Press Gallery and asked, "How many more stories need to break before the system itself admits it's broken?" The room stood in silence. For a full 30 seconds, no one moved. And then came the applause, not roaring, not chaotic, but rising like a tide, steady, relentless, from delegates, from press, even from rivals. No slogans. No slogans. No chants. Just one clear, unified message. We heard you. Later that evening, Colbert's resignation was quietly submitted to CBS. Not fired, not disgraced. Just gone. Meghan left the summit without giving interviews, without a press conference. Her team handed out copies of her speech on paper, no branding, no QR codes, no digital tracking. Just ink on pages, and as she boarded her flight home, the world finally understood she didn't want revenge. She wanted reform, and she got it. The days that followed felt like an earthquake spreading quietly beneath the surface. No visible destruction at first, but powerful enough to rattle governments, newsrooms, and royal corridors alike. Meghan Markle had disappeared from public view. No Instagram posts, no podcast teasers. No comments from her team beyond that one stark sentence. She was invited to tell her story, not to relive her trauma. But her absence was not silence, it was pressure. And everyone felt it. In Washington, D.C., senior White House staff gathered in the West Wing for an emergency communications briefing. The Meghan Colbert interview had spiraled into something no one had expected. A political flashpoint. What began as a late-night television segment had now sparked national conversations on mental health, racial bias, and media responsibility. One staffer pointed to the data scrolling across a monitor. Engagement has exploded across all demographics. Gen Z is outraged. Millennials are echoing it. Even middle-aged suburban voters, this story hit harder than any press conference we've held this year. President Kamala Harris, seated at the head of the conference table, listened in silence. Her chief of staff leaned in. This escalates, we'll be asked to comment either directly or by association. She's American, a former royal, a global figure in mental health advocacy. This could become a diplomatic issue. Kamala nodded. Slowly, keep it quiet for now, but monitor the UK's response. And alert the UN team this may reach international platforms. Across the Atlantic, inside the Foreign Office in London, a similar meeting was taking place. But the tone was colder, paler, more calculated. Royal advisors had seen the viral footage too. They had watched Meghan walk out, seen Colbert's stunned expression. And most importantly, they had seen the crowd's stillness. The silence said everything. And it terrified them. The American press is leaning toward sympathy, one senior official said. We cannot afford another PR disaster tied to the Sussexes, especially not with trade talks coming up. Another advisor flipped through a folder. Our relationship with the American media was already strained after the Oprah interview. This just lit the match again. A plan was forming. Not to respond, but to contain. Private calls were made to UK-friendly outlets across New York and LA. Whisper campaigns began. Anonymous sources close to the palace fed stories about Meghan's emotional volatility, strategic victimhood, and manipulative behavior. The goal was clear: shape the narrative before it became untouchable. But this time, it didn't work. The American public, particularly younger and progressive voters, didn't buy it. A CNN segment featuring 3 female mental health experts called the interview a televised breakdown orchestrated by ego, not journalism. MSNBC invited trauma survivors to speak about the experience of being publicly questioned about private pain. Suddenly, Colbert's signature humor wasn't aging well. His past interviews, ones where he used cutting wit to challenge women, especially women of color, were now being clipped and analyzed. His 2017 grilling of Senator Kamala Harris resurfaced. His awkward exchange with Serena Williams made the rounds again, and inside CBS, silent war was brewing. Half the staff believed Colbert had done what journalists were meant to do: ask hard questions. The other half whispered about how deeply personal the questions had been, how unnecessary, how mean. One producer who had worked the night of Meghan's segment quietly resigned. In her farewell email, she wrote, "That wasn't journalism, that was performance." Behind the scenes, legal discussions began. Meghan's lawyers sent informal inquiries about how the segment was edited, what was agreed upon beforehand, and whether CBS had misrepresented the tone of the show to her team. Nothing official yet, but enough to send a chill through the legal department. Then, strange thing happened. The United Nations Committee on Media Ethics reached out to Meghan's foundation. A quiet invitation. They wanted her perspective on televised emotional manipulation and public harassment. No cameras. Just a room of international policymakers who were beginning to see her story as something larger, something systemic, in private. Meghan considered it. She said almost nothing to her team, just listened. She had not watched the clip since it aired. But every time someone mentioned it, she paused. It's as if she was carrying a clock that ticked quietly in her chest, waiting for the right moment. And in New York, Stephen Colbert sat in his dressing room 2 hours before his next live taping. The studio was quiet. His writers handed him monologue drafts, but he tossed them aside. None of the jokes worked. He looked into the mirror, eyes tired, face worn, and whispered the question no one else would ask him. Did I break her? Number. One answered. But outside, the protests had already begun small at first. Signs with her final words. "You're using my pain as entertainment." Within days, the signs would grow. And the world would realize this story was no longer about a TV show, it was about power. And who had the right to hold the mic? In the weeks that followed the UN summit, something unusual settled over the global media landscape. Stillness. Late-night monologues quieted. Tabloid headlines softened. The usual parade of outrage and spectacle paused as if the industry itself had become self-aware, ashamed even. Meghan Markle had not exposed a person. She had exposed a pattern. And the pattern was breaking. Colbert's resignation, though quiet, sent shockwaves through the industry. CBS issued a sanitized statement thanking him for years of service, thought-provoking dialogue, and memorable moments. But no replacement was announced. His chair sat empty for weeks. Audiences noticed. Sponsors noticed. Other networks began reviewing their editorial policies, some out of fear, others out of genuine concern. Across social media, the narrative began to evolve. The outrage gave way to introspection. Videos titled "Why We Watched Her Hurt," "Entertainment," or "Exploitation." And redefining truth in interviews gained millions of views. Thought leaders, academics, and psychologists were invited onto major platforms not to gossip, but to explain. Why do we consume pain? Why do we reward cruelty masked as conversation? A cultural mirror had been lifted. People didn't like what they saw. Meanwhile, Meghan remained largely unseen. No magazine covers, no Netflix trailers, no surprise. Podcast drops, just silence. Not withdrawal, but discipline. Every decision now calculated not to reignite the fire, but to let the world look at the ashes in Los Angeles. Her foundation released a comprehensive report co-authored with the UN, titled "Echo Chambers and Emotional Consent: Ethics in the Age of Broadcast." It outlined 3 key recommendations. Interview agreements must include trauma protocols. All televised confrontations should require guest pre-disclosure of sensitive topics. Networks must establish internal ethical review panels for high risk segments. At first, the report was seen as idealistic. But within a month, 3 major media outlets, including CNN International, signed pledges to begin implementation. CBS did not. Then, unexpectedly, the British Parliament held a special session on press accountability and broadcast responsibility. What began as a local motion turned into an international hearing. Meghan was not present, but she was everywhere, in spirit. Experts cited her experience. Footage from Crown and Conflict was played for MPs. Even conservative members, long dismissive of her, acknowledged the changing wind. At one point, a Labour MP stood before the chamber and said, "It is not about whether we like her. It is about whether we like ourselves after watching what we allowed to happen." Back in the U.S., Stephen Colbert remained out of the public eye. Rumors swirled about a private retreat, a book in progress, a possible return. But nothing was confirmed. And in his absence, a question lingered across studio walls. What happens when the joke isn't funny anymore? It was not just talk shows facing pressure. Streaming platforms began inserting disclaimers before reality TV content involving emotional distress. Production studios consulted mental health professionals before editing celebrity interviews. And talent agents started negotiating contracts with emotional protection. Clauses, no ambush language, became standard, but not everyone was ready for change. One rising podcast host tried to mock the movement in a segment titled "You Can't Even Joke Anymore." He made light of Meghan's silence and called the UN Summit Hollywood Therapy Hour. The backlash was immediate. Sponsors pulled out. His episodes were removed from Spotify within 72 hours. The message was clear. The culture had shifted. The audience had evolved, and then quietly, Meghan returned. Not in a public broadcast, but in a classroom in Oakland, California. She visited a public high school unannounced to speak with journalism students. No press were invited, but one blurry photo leaked her sitting on the edge of a desk. No microphone, no teleprompter. Just talking. A student who was present posted. Later, she told us that truth doesn't always live in studios or on stages. Sometimes it's just sitting quietly in a room, choosing not to lie. The post went viral. But Meghan never commented on it. In the end, she had done what very few people in modern public life ever achieve. She changed the story without ever needing to tell it again. She refused to weaponize her pain. She refused to sell her dignity. And because of that, she became more than a headline. More than a princess. More than a scandal. She became a symbol of what journalism could be, of what media must become. And for once, the world didn't cheer. It listened.